What happens when a billionaire's unchecked cruelty collides with someone who has been quietly watching for 18 years? Watch as Grayson Whitlock III's gilded facade begins to crack, and the maid he once believed invisible turns a single evening's insult into the start of his undoing. Comment where you're watching from so everyone can join in and enjoy the story. Don't forget to like and subscribe if this pulls you in. If you like this story, remember to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The penthouse was a museum of light and control. Chandeliers threw golden nets across polished parquet, catching on silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. The air smelled of orchids and wealth. Grayson Whitlock moved through it like a man gliding over a private kingdom, each nod and handshake as rehearsed as his smile. Eve Carter carried her tray the way she had for nearly 2 decades, level-balanced eyes low, but never blind. She noted the camera sweeps in the corners, the predictable 8-second pause, the crystal hook in the study, where Whitlock's security fob hung like an ornament, the leather folio set slightly askew on a credenza. These things registered automatically. Survival had made her a quiet archivist. The sound of disaster was soft at first, a shift in weight, a glass stem scraping another. Miguel Santos, new to the staff, and unsteady with the tray of champagne, stumbled as a guest backed into him. Liquid arced through the light, splashing across Senator Douglas Pierce's charcoal suit. Conversation thinned. The string quartet faltered a fraction. Whitlock crossed the room with sudden precision, seizing Miguel by the collar and driving him into the bookcase. Leather spines trembled in place. Gasps flickered at the edges of the room, but never bloomed into protest. Eve set down her tray and stepped forward. Whitlock turned toward her, expression sharpening. The back of his hand swept outward, colliding with the tray she'd just placed aside. Crystal exploded across the floor. Champagne bloomed cold on her uniform glass, slicing her wrist in a single clean line. His words were measured but edged like a blade. The insult landed heavy, soaked in the practiced racism of a man who assumed the room agreed with him. Around them, faces turned away, some toward glasses, others toward their shoes. Senator Pierce's aide guided him quietly from the scene, his stained suit left to be dealt with by hands in uniforms. The police chief, Randall Keene, stood at Whitlock's side, hand lightly on the billionaire's arm, gaze sweeping the cameras before drifting over the guests. No tension in his grip, no sign of reprimand. Only silent confirmation, nothing here would reach beyond these walls. Eve pressed a folded napkin to her wrist, counted her breathing, until the metallic taste eased. Miguel's eyes were wide, still pinned to the shelves by the memory of Whitlock's grip. A subtle motion toward the kitchen freed him. Crystal fragments continued their slow roll across the parquet, catching the chandelier light in splinters. The head housekeeper's voice cut through crisp and impersonal reset for dessert service. Staff moved in with towels and brooms. The quartet shifted back to brightness. The guests resumed their practiced rhythm. Eve worked the perimeter of the mess, containing the spill, sweeping up what could slice a shoe or leave a claim. Each bend and lift measured each motion under the sweep of those cameras. Her eyes returned to the study door. The crystal hook glinted in her peripheral vision. She memorized its height, its position relative to the molding, the 8-second sweep she would have before a lens turned back. The evening continued, each moment polished over the crack that had opened in its center. Whitlock returned to his circle of investors, laughter restored to its proper volume. His CFO, Martin Kessler, watched from the edge of the crowd, the stillness of his posture hiding calculation. Every detail in his glance read as a mental ledger of damage and containment. When the guests began to thin, Eve wheeled her cart toward the service hall. In its shadowed quiet, She traded the napkin for a butterfly bandage from the first aid tin she had placed there years ago. Staff looked after staff. No one else would. Her routine carried her back to the study. She polished the glass desk, adjusted the angle of the chair, wiped the prints from the floor-to-ceiling windows. She touched nothing she shouldn't. But her mind catalogued the desk's weight shift, the grain where it ran crosswise, the plausible spots for a hidden compartment. She left the room immaculate, her face calm, her pulse steady. In her pocket, a battered phone waited with a number she rarely dialed, a favor owed from years before. She didn't call. Not yet. When the elevator doors closed behind her at the end of the shift, the city stretched out below, lit and endless. She had not taken anything from Whitlock tonight, but she had taken note. And sometimes she knew that was the first theft a man like him never saw coming. Night pulled Manhattan into a darker version of itself. Neon stretched thin over glass and steel. Eve Carter rode the service elevator alone, the cart in front of her, clinking with used crystal lipstick-smeared napkins and the scent of over-poured champagne. The penthouse was nearly empty now. Staff moved in muted rhythms, fold polish stack, preparing for the next immaculate event. When the last of the cleaning crew filed out, Eve stayed behind under the pretext of finishing the study. The truth was quieter, sharper. The room smelled of leather and citrus polish. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline like a possession. The desk, a slab of rosewood worth more than her year's wages, anchored the space. She began with the glass slow circles that cleared smudges invisible to anyone else. When she crouched to wipe beneath the drawers, the cloth snagged on an edge. A metallic click. The bottom panel shifted under her hand, tilting just enough to reveal a hidden space. Inside, a slim flash drive labeled in Whitlock's neat print, insurance. Beside it, contracts stamped with offshore company seals and addresses in places built for secrecy. Her pulse climbed, but her movements stayed measured. She slid the flash drive into the deep pocket of her apron, replaced the documents precisely, and pressed the panel closed until the click returned. The desk looked untouched. From the hallway came only the low hum of the building's climate control. Cameras would show her routine, no sudden motions, no searching, only a maid completing her work. The elevator dropped her into the sub-basement where steam curled from laundry vents, and the air smelled faintly of bleach. She walked through the service tunnel to the subway, blending into the slow trickle of night shift workers. She didn't ride home. Instead, she switched trains twice, doubling back once to make sure she wasn't followed. At Roosevelt Avenue, she surfaced the streetlights humming overhead and cut east toward a walk-up in Queens. Vanessa Fee Reyes answered before Eve could knock. Her hair was pulled back, eyes scanning the street behind Eve. She owed Eve from years ago, a night when Whitlock's private security had tried to break a union meeting, and Eve had found her a way out through the service entrance. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and soldering flux. At the table sat Priya Patel, a laptop open in front of her cables, feeding into a small device that looked jury-rigged from half a dozen others. She didn't ask questions. She didn't look up until Eve placed the flash drive on the table. Priya worked quickly. The drive was cloned to a secure system with no connections air-gapped from the outside world. Files unfolded on the screen in cascading lists, spreadsheets, scanned contracts, internal memos. Numbers lined up in columns like soldiers' payments to shell companies, charitable transfers to private accounts, altered safety inspection dates, and names: Police Chief Randall Keene, Senator Douglas Pierce, judges, inspectors, union leaders. The sums were deliberate, large enough to buy loyalty, regular enough to enforce it. They paused at one folder locked behind a passphrase, List A. Priya noted its encryption, but didn't touch it yet. Too obvious to force, she murmured. Eve watched without speaking. Her wrist throbbed under the gauze, the cut from Whitlock's broken glass still fresh. In the files, she saw the shape of something she had always suspected but never touched, the architecture of power that made men like him untouchable. They began to plan. The goal was not a single strike, but a sequence each release timed to maximum damage. The first drop would align with Whitlock's high-profile market appearance in 3 days, the moment when every camera in the financial district would be pointed at him. To guard against silence, they built redundancy. Priya's dead man's switch would trigger full release of every file if they disappeared or lost contact. Multiple encrypted backups were scattered across hidden drives and cloud vaults under false names. They spoke less in sentences than in Outline's first-wave offshore accounts. Second, falsified safety inspections. Third, political bribes coordinated with live footage. Eve barely touched the tea V poured for her. She watched the files being mirrored, each progress bar another step toward something irreversible. By dawn, the plan was in motion. They shut down every device, locking the originals in separate locations. Eve left with a burner phone and an address for a safe house. On the subway back toward her own neighborhood, she kept the phone in her pocket and her eyes on the windows. The city passed in reflected fragments. She knew the risk now wasn't just losing her job, it was vanishing without a trace, the way other names in those files had disappeared. Above ground, the September air felt heavier, as if the city knew something was coming. Eve walked the final blocks to her building, each step carrying the weight of 2 decades of quiet observation and one night's decisive theft. The uniform in her laundry bag still smelled faintly of Whitlock's cologne. Soon, she thought the world would smell the rot beneath it. Morning light scraped across the city's glass towers, sharp and cold. Eve Carter woke to the thud of her landlord's note sliding under the door. The paper was short-printed and unsigned, multiple complaints received. Unauthorized activity on premises. Immediate response required. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Her phone buzzed again before she could fold the notice. The alert was from a news feed. Whitlock Industries announces termination of domestic staff member Eve Carter for misconduct and theft. The company statement used clinical language, emotional instability, inappropriate behavior pending legal action. Classic. Discredit the source before the story breathes. The day turned heavier as it went. Surveillance vans parked near corners she'd walked for years. A black sedan idled opposite her building for an hour before sliding away. Whitlock's machine was moving, and it was moving fast. By nightfall, the first counterstrike came. News broke of the death of Maya Chen, the investigative journalist V had trusted to break the opening stories. The official report called it a suicide. The details were too neat a note, found professional pressure, cited vague mentions of regret over recent work. The files they'd prepared with her were untouched. The dead man's switch hadn't triggered. But the message was clear. V didn't answer her phone that night. Priya's updates were clipped eyes flicking between screens as she monitored chatter from both the press and the darker corners of the net. Andre Lewis, the night shift guard from Whitlock Tower, arrived carrying a thumb drive of his own internal security footage, showing Whitlock's pattern of verbal and physical abuse, complete with audio he didn't know was being recorded. The footage matched dates in the drive Eve had stolen. They gathered at Priya's safe location, a bare room above a laundromat with a single folding table and 3 laptops. The burner phone sat between them like a small, silent metronome. On one screen, Priya pried at List A, the encrypted folder she'd left untouched before. The decryption fought back with stubborn complexity. Andre and Eve went through names, cross-referencing payment entries, with news of accidents, suicides, and abrupt resignations. Patterns emerged. Judges whose rulings favored Whitlock. Police captains who suppressed investigations. labor organizers who vanished mid-campaign. In the corner of the list, certain entries carried an extra note cleanup required. Each one sat within days of a suspicious death. 3 journalists in the past year, an environmental activist in Oregon, a whistleblower in Detroit. The room's air thickened with what the list implied. Whitlock didn't just buy silence, he erased it. The door to the laundromat below clattered. A customer's voice rose muffled. The safe room's hum felt louder by contrast. Then Priya's screen flashed green. List A opened. Names, amounts, supporting documents. Bank transfers, recorded calls, scanned contracts. Every thread linked back to Whitlock's central accounts, or one of his shell companies. The burner phone vibrated once. A message with no sender, "You're next." No point pretending it wasn't meant for her. They prepared for the possibility of a breach. Go bags by the door. Files mirrored to 3 separate encrypted drives. Priya embedded invisible watermarks into every document proof against claims of forgery. But Whitlock moved faster. Within an hour, the police bulletin went public. Eve Carter wanted for corporate espionage, theft of trade secrets, conspiracy. Her ID photo taken from Whitlock's HR records appeared on news tickers and in precinct emails. The description was plain approach with caution. Andre checked the window. A man in an unmarked windbreaker stood across the street, talking into his collar. The first attempt came subtle, a scrape at the back window latch. Priya's keystrokes triggered a decoy alarm, 2 buildings over, drawing the watchers away for a minute, maybe less. They left through the rear stairwell, splitting into separate directions on the sidewalk. Eve kept her stride, even pausing at a food cart, blending into the slow river of office workers and students. She switched trains twice before circling to Priya's secondary site, an old upholstery shop with a locked back office. Andre was already pacing there when she arrived. Priya came minutes later, a hard drive in her bag and tension in her shoulders. The news was waiting on the small TV in the corner. The chyron ran in bright red. Investigative journalist Maya Chen found dead. The anchor's voice was steady, detached. The footage was of a body covered by a white sheet police tape fluttering in the wind. Eve stood still, hands curled, jaw tight. Maya had been alive that morning. She'd faced Whitlock at press conferences, asked questions no one else dared. And now her story was already being dismantled, her name wrapped in whispers of instability. In the safe room's dim light, the 3 of them sat with the truth. Whitlock's reach wasn't limited to boardrooms and bank accounts. It extended into the kind of darkness where people disappeared and reappeared as headlines with no further investigation. They couldn't wait for the perfect moment. If the first wave of evidence wasn't released soon, there might not be a second. Rain glazed the streets outside Caldwell Tower, turning the sidewalks into sheets of fractured light. In the loading bay, a catering van idled, steam curling from its exhaust. Eve Carter stood in its shadow, wearing a black blazer with a discreet company logo stitched above the pocket. A button in the lapel was not a button at all, but the hidden lens of a live stream camera. Priya's voice came faint in her earpiece. Audio check. Video steady. All feeds mirrored. Andre's was steadier, lower security rotation, gives you 20 minutes between shifts. Service entrance keypad code 4773. The blazer's fabric smelled faintly of starch and metal. Eve kept her face blank as she joined a cluster of catering staff filing through the rear entrance. Inside the service hallways felt familiar storage rooms lined with racks of silver, the faint buzz of refrigeration units. She kept her head down. Past the swinging kitchen doors, she caught glimpses of the conference room being prepared, heavy drapes drawn against the night, a long table set with water pitchers and pressed portfolios. Security stood at each exit, scanning the crowd as early arrivals took their seats. The room filled with board members, investors, political allies, many of the same faces who had turned away the night of the gala. Their voices were low, urgent. Stock prices had been falling all day, the slide accelerated by rumors that had not yet been tied to a source. Eve moved methodically, refilling glasses, aligning silverware, angling herself so that the lapel camera kept Grayson Whitlock in frame. He stood at the podium, smiling with the ease of a man convinced he could still bend the story back in his favor. Andre's update reached her between steps, federal team in position. Ruiz waiting on the east mezzanine. Priya's first evidence packet queued for release. The lights dimmed. A projector hummed, throwing the Whitlock Industries logo across the wall. The chatter dissolved into expectation. Whitlock began with the cadence of control, strong, steady, almost bored. These allegations are malicious. This company maintains the highest standards. The phrases rolled out in smooth succession, practiced in private before being offered to the room. Eve positioned herself at the back, near the heavy velvet drapes. The phone in her pocket was already unlocked to the list names, amounts, transactions. She waited for the moment when his words became brittle. It came faster than expected. A board member demanded an explanation for the collapse of an overseas factory. Another pointed to stock losses. Whitlock's smile thinned. He interrupted more than he answered, the edges of his voice sharpening. Priya's whisper slid into Eve's ear. Now. She stepped from the shadows and began walking toward the front. The lapel camera caught Whitlock's profile as he noticed her, the recognition hardening into something darker. She stopped within reach of the podium, holding her phone just high enough for the lens to catch its glow. The list scrolled. Names and figures spilled into the live feed. Judges paid to dismiss cases, police captains compensated to erase investigations, politicians rewarded for obstructing oversight. Priya matched each name with the corresponding document in real time, filling the split screens of viewers watching from phones and monitors across the city. A murmur spread through the room. Chairs scraped. One board member pushed back from the table, announcing her resignation on the spot. Others followed their departures as sharp as slaps in the quiet. Whitlock's composure cracked. His voice rose thick with disbelief and fury. Security, remove her now. No one moved. Andre had positioned himself near the door, credentials visible, posture unyielding. Federal authority carried its own gravity. The viewer count spiked on Priya's monitors, hundreds of thousands climbing. Whitlock's jaw clenched. He stepped toward Eve, closing the distance in 3 strides. The camera caught every line in his face, every flicker of rage. His hand shot out, fingers brushing the lens hidden in the blazer, but Eve shifted, holding her ground. The phone's light illuminated them both. The feed showed her unflinching expression against his distorted fury. The doors burst open. Agent Carla Ruiz entered with her team weapons, drawn voices firm and clipped. Federal investigation. Everyone remain where you are. Whitlock turned toward the sound, but Ruiz's gaze locked on him. Charges followed, each one: deliberate conspiracy, racketeering, obstruction of justice, witness, intimidation. The room froze as agents moved in, securing him with swift, efficient motions. Eve stepped back, the camera still streaming. In the background, Whitlock's empire began to fracture. Resignations, phone calls to lawyers, the rustle of papers no longer protected. The live feed didn't cut. It lingered on the image of a billionaire in handcuffs, led past the same people who had once applauded him. Outside, the rain kept falling, pooling in the gutters, washing the streets clean. The elevator doors opened to a wall of camera flashes. Federal agents moved Grayson Whitlock through the lobby, his wrists locked in steel, his suit jacket torn at the shoulder. The building's marble echoed with the shuffle of shoes, the clipped commands of law enforcement, the low hum of reporters feeding lines into microphones. Outside, black SUVs idled in the rain, their roofs beaded with water under the orange glare of street lamps. Whitlock didn't look back. The glass doors closed behind him, shutting out the chorus of voices asking how a man with his influence could fall so fast. Upstairs, the boardroom was a field of debris, abandoned portfolios, half full, glasses, chairs pushed out of place. Agent Carla Ruiz directed her team through the remains, tagging hard drives, boxing financial ledgers, photographing every surface. Each tag was a weight on Whitlock's empire. Eve Carter stood by the window, the city lights smearing across the glass. She could still feel the heat of the podium lights on her face, the texture of the phone in her hand, as she read the names into the live feed. She'd expected to feel triumph, but what came was quieter, a heavy, measured exhale. On Priya's laptop, the stream replayed in muted loops. Every platform carried it now, Whitlock's denial dissolving under the evidence, the resignations the moment the federal team entered. Viewer counts passed 3 million before midnight. Andre leaned against the doorframe, scanning his messages. News from inside the precinct, multiple officers named in List A were already in custody. Their protests cut short by matching bank records and internal memos. The ripple was spreading outward. Down in the lobby, Ruiz briefed the press. Her voice was even methodical: charges, filed assets, frozen restitution funds in process. When asked how the investigation began, she only said, "A witness came forward with verifiable evidence." By morning, orange seizure notices were posted on Whitlock's properties, his private residence, corporate headquarters, the foundation's offices. Photographs of the bright paper under dripping awnings appeared on news sites before the ink dried. Eve left the tower before dawn, escorted through a side exit. She kept her head low, blazer collar turned against the rain. In her pocket, the burner phone buzzed with a message from her brother. "They dropped everything. I'm out." Jamal's voice followed when she called, shaken but free. No charges, no record. At the community legal clinic, V waited with fresh bruises and a flash drive. She had slipped out of Whitlock's circle 2 nights earlier, with internal system logs, timestamps proving the security cameras were disabled during key deliveries, records of hush payments to families after accidental deaths. Ruiz's team folded the files into the case without hesitation. Through the day, messages poured in from whistleblowers, former employees, contractors who had been strong-armed into silence. Priya cataloged them all, her hands never leaving the keyboard. Andre coordinated statements matching each new testimony to evidence from the drives. The city moved around them, unchanged in rhythm, but altered in awareness. Whitlock's face stared from newsstands, sometimes with the words "fallen tycoon," sometimes with a single line. The witness spoke. Evening came with a slow, steady rain. Eve walked alone to Caldwell Tower one last time. The glass facade was dark, its lobby lit only by the reflections of traffic lights on wet marble. The seizure notice on the door fluttered in the damp wind. She reached out and pressed it flat against the glass, feeling the cold seep through to her skin. 58 floors of glass and steel had been built on silence. Tonight, they stood as a monument to the cost of breaking it. She turned away, the street glistening under sodium light. The burner phone vibrated. Priya again. "We did it." Eve's reply was simple. "One down." The subway swallowed her, its tunnels echoing with the usual mix of conversations and announcements. Somewhere above, reporters still pieced together the chronology. Analysts speculated about what would come next. But the truth was already loose, replicated 1,000 times over, immune to deletion. By the time she reached her apartment, the rain had deepened. She stood for a moment at the window, watching it blur the city into streaks of light and shadow. The fight wasn't over, not with so many names still on that list, but the first blow had landed and the giant had fallen. In the distance, Thunder rolled over the skyline. Eve let the sound settle, then pulled the curtain closed. That wraps the full story arc, beginning with the public humiliation moving through the theft and exposure into the high-stakes confrontation, and ending with Whitlock's collapse and Eve's quiet exit. What happens when a billionaire family's cruelty spills into the open, and a town built on silence finally hears itself scream? Watch as the Langfords' polished facade fractures, exposing the rot beneath, and a house steward named Ethan Cole decides to turn humiliation into evidence. Tell us where you're watching from so more people can join in and enjoy the story. If this grips you, remember to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. In Maple Hollow, brutality wore perfume. It drifted from the chandeliers of the Langford estate, threaded through mahogany halls, and settled like dust on the backs of the people who worked there. The Langfords had the kind of money that made speed limits optional and consequences negotiable. Real estate construction influence a fortune sized at just over $300 million and amortized across the hearts of a small southern town. Ethan Cole, late 20s. Black learned quickly that invisibility was a skill. He had perfected it in the mansion's kitchen corridors: glide, pour, observe, nothing. 14 hours of polishing silver and rehearsing the dance between crystal and linen had drained his muscles to a low, buzzing ache. He stepped into the dining room with a tray of roasted duck, resisting the reflex to look up at the chandelier, the same chandelier that taught him not to look up at all. The table stretched like a runway, lined with the county's chosen legal counsels who never filed certain papers, builders who always won certain bids, wives whose charity committees could launder a reputation faster than money. At the far end sprawled 13-year-old Preston Langford Jr., the heir bored in the curated way of boys who have never heard the word no. His prep school blazer had the studied dishevelment of expense masquerading as ease. In Maple Hollow, wealth practiced casual like an accent. Ethan moved with a measured grace to refill water. A shoe shot out, small, deliberate, the sneaker of a boy rehearsing power. Ethan stumbled, saved the pitcher, and caught the laughter lift off the linen like steam. A mother's indulgent smile mediated everything. Surely a harmless prank, surely nothing at all. Across the glass wall of the room, the gardens held a last wash of dusk. A figure stood among the roses, the new gardener, Daniel Price. He looked up, and in the split second of eye contact, there was no pity, only appraisal, a quiet inventory that asked, "Are you safe?" The room's laughter hung, then thinned. Boredom returned to the boy like gravity. Entertainment would be supplied. Words followed, not shouted, merely laid down flat and cold, and the order crystallized in the air. Ethan's spine understood before his mind did the centuries of it settling at once on the floor, then the bark, then the circuit around the table. Not a game, not a dare. A demonstration. The wealthy often confuse humiliation for humor. The room assisted with phones angled just so, with laughter curated for the algorithm, with the silence of those who would later insist they hadn't really seen. He lowered himself. His palms met the rug's tufted roughness. Knees protested, fabric scraped. The world narrowed to the geometry of chair legs and the exhale of breath against polished wood. He moved. Laughter rose, swelled, pitched upward, when a dinner roll arced and struck his chest. Behind the glass, the gardener did not move. Daniel held his body very still and let a small device do the work. A slim offline camera lens, clean battery full. He kept its recording card mirrored to a tiny encrypted drive in his pocket, by habit, a muscle memory from another life. Daniel's posture told a longer story. Once a labor rights attorney, he had learned that certain towns confuse official channels with disposal chutes. He carried redundancies the way other men carried lucky coins. The camera was air-gapped. The spare microSD lived inside a weatherproof capsule at the base of his pruning bag. A third copy would be written to a write-once drive before midnight, and one page of meticulous notes would be inked by hand. Nothing touched the cloud. The cloud was owned. Ethan completed the circuit under a rain of amusement and flashes. Each bark the room demanded took a wedge out of his breath. He found himself cataloging ridiculous details, how the crystal threw small galaxies along the ceiling, how the roast's rosemary followed him like an unearned blessing, how the fabric of one guest's dress whispered when she shifted to get a better angle. This is how memory works under duress. It saves the smallest outlines because the center is a burn. It ended not with mercy, but with boredom's return. Laughter tapered, phones lowered. A mother lifted her wine glass in that shuddering gesture that signals to staff, "We are done here." Ethan backed out, as if fogged in, then found the night air and the stone steps behind the kitchen. The cold laid a clean palm on his face. He stared at his hands until they steadied, then at his forearms, where the rug had left a faint, stippled red. Gardens breathed differently at night. The roses had given up their light, but not their scent, which moved in slow coils past the clipped hedges. The gate clicked. Shoes on gravel approached and stopped at the respectful distance of someone who understands wounds that don't show. Daniel rested his pruning bag at his feet. He did not speak at first. He lowered himself onto the step, left a cushion of air between their shoulders, and simply matched Ethan's breathing until the rhythm evened. There was no grand speech. Instead, a sequence the small camera placed palm up, so that its red record light faced the ground, the quick transfer to a tamper-resistant drive no larger than a house key, the insertion of the second copy into a dull gray capsule that clicked shut with the certainty of a vault. The capsule went into the soil beside the path with a practiced press of Daniel's thumb shallow enough to retrieve deep enough to survive curiosity. On a notepad, Daniel printed in tight block letters the date time and a summary of what the lens had seen. Ink, not pixels. Paper doesn't get hacked. Somewhere inside, another course was being announced. Cutlery made that thin chiming sound against plates. Out here, the crickets kept time indifferent and exact. The humiliation did not recede, not yet. It changed temperature, cooled from scald to ache. Ethan recognized the geometry of a choice forming in the air between them. In Maple Hollow, choices like this were expensive. Daniel's presence made one promise without saying it. If the town insisted on erasing, they would start with a page that could not be deleted. Evidence would not ride the rails of the systems the Langfords owned. It would travel by older routes, metal and paper, human memory and soil. Ethan sat up straighter. In the window's reflection, his uniform still looked tidy. Degradation has a way of selecting the marks you can't launder away. He took the drive and slipped it into the inner seam he had long ago stitched into his jacket for cash tips and emergency bus fare. Tonight, it became something else. Not redemption. Not yet. A hinge. Inside, laughter lifted again, thinner now, already hunting a new spectacle. Out here, two men listened to the night, decide what it would keep. Tomorrow would bring officials with smiles and the performance of concern. It would bring denial with letterhead and the peculiar exhaustion of rooms where justice is treated like a scheduling conflict. But tomorrow had not arrived. Tonight, there was a capsule in the soil, a drive against a rib cage, and the faint suspicion that invisibility for once might not be the safest armor. Morning in Maple Hollow began like it always did, a polite quiet that smelled of magnolia and fresh asphalt masking the rot beneath. The Langford estate was already awake kitchen staff, moving in the mechanical rhythm that kept the household from collapsing under its own weight. Ethan Cole moved among them without a word, his eyes on the clock, his mind replaying the night before. The flash drive from Daniel Price was a solid weight in his pocket. It wasn't a keepsake, it was a liability, the kind that could end a career or a life. Ethan understood the unwritten rule of this town: you did not embarrass the Langfords in public. You certainly didn't keep a permanent record of it. By mid-morning, Daniel appeared at the service entrance, pruning shears in one hand, a small leather case in the other. He set the case on the counter without ceremony. Inside lay two more identical drives, a spiral notebook with neat handwriting, and a folded map. The map showed 3 locations marked in red, one in town, one in the hills, one across the state line. Backup caches. If one was compromised, 2 more would survive. Daniel's notes didn't just describe what happened. They documented who was in the room, their affiliations, their likely political weight. Ethan scanned the list: judges, developers, a state senator's wife, and felt the picture sharpen. This wasn't just a cruel boy humiliating a servant. It was an audience of power, complicit by choice. By noon, they were walking toward the low brick rectangle of the Maple Hollow Police Department. The front desk officer, a heavy-set man in a pale blue uniform, barely looked up from his monitor. The moment Daniel mentioned the Langfords, the air shifted. Paperwork was shuffled to the bottom of a stack. The receptionist's voice took on a syrupy politeness that was in small towns a warning. They waited 20 minutes before Sheriff Wade Calhoun appeared. Tall, with the ruddy complexion of someone who lived on golf courses, Calhoun gave the kind of smile that erased nothing from the eyes. Ethan placed the drive on the table in the small interview room. Calhoun didn't touch it. Instead, he leaned back, laced his fingers, and let silence expand until it was almost physical. When the sheriff finally spoke, it was in measured tones. The matter was unfortunate, but the video looked playful and without criminal intent. Ethan's protest was cut off with a slow shake of Calhoun's head. In a community like ours, he said, it's best to resolve misunderstandings privately. The words were smooth, but the meaning was granite. Back at the mansion that evening, the message came faster than expected. Ethan was gathering his things from the staff locker room when his phone vibrated. The screen displayed nothing but an unknown number and a single line of text: delete everything or disappear. No punctuation, no sender ID. It didn't need either. That night, the house was quieter than usual. Most of the Langfords were at a gala in the city, leaving a skeleton crew of staff behind. Ethan moved carefully, timing his steps between the security patrols. The basement door was unmarked, half hidden behind crates of floral arrangements. He had passed it dozens of times without curiosity. Tonight, the thin blade of light beneath it stopped him. The hinges resisted as he pushed the door open. Inside was a space that didn't match the rest of the house: low ceiling, concrete floor, climate-controlled air. Against one wall, a row of steel filing cabinets stood like sentinels. A desk occupied the center, its surface littered with papers in various states of disorder. The glow from the monitor was the only light casting sharp shadows across manila folders. Ethan's eyes scanned the first open folder. Payroll ledgers, but the figures didn't align with the wages workers actually received. He took out his phone and began photographing each page, careful to keep the lens steady. The next file was worse: correspondence between the Langfords and local officials coded, but clear kickbacks, zoning favors, contract rigging. Deeper in the drawers were bank statements with transfers to offshore accounts, invoices from shell companies, and lists of undocumented workers paired with notes on leverage threats to ensure compliance. The patterns were unmistakable: wage theft, fraud, human exploitation at an industrial scale. Near the bottom of one drawer, he found a leather-bound ledger embossed with a gold L. This one read like a history of influence: names, dates, amounts, and outcomes. Judge reassignments, investigations closed, competitors bankrupted. One entry from 2 years prior noted a Calhoun retainer renewed alongside a six-figure payment. Ethan's phone storage filled quickly. He swapped in the spare SD card Daniel had given him. Each card was labeled with nothing more than a date and a single letter D for documents, V for video. The discipline was deliberate. If someone found one, they wouldn't know what it contained without opening it, and that would trigger the encryption lock. Footsteps echoed faintly from above. He slid everything back into place, checking each folder's angle against the desk's scratches. The monitor was shut down, the chair nudged back exactly as he'd found it. Invisibility required precision. He exited through the garden-level door, the October air biting at his cheeks. The path along the rose garden was empty, except for Daniel trimming under a work light. Ethan didn't stop until they reached the staff parking lot. Only then did he hand over the SD card. Daniel turned it over in his fingers. This, he said, isn't just enough to embarrass them. It's enough to dismantle them. For the first time that day, Ethan allowed himself the smallest nod. Not agreement resolve. The ember had caught. Now it would need tending. The following week moved like a tightening wire. Inside the Langford estate, every step Ethan Cole took felt watched. Foot traffic in the corridors shifted. Certain doors that had always been left ajar were now closed. The other staff sensed it too. More glances over shoulders, more sudden silences when supervisors appeared. Daniel Price kept to the gardens, his pruning schedule rearranged so he could cross paths with Ethan at predictable times. Their exchanges were brief, a folded slip of paper left under a coffee cup, a plain envelope tucked into the glove compartment of Ethan's old sedan. They never lingered in view of the mansion's cameras. The evidence from the basement had been duplicated onto 2 new drives and placed in separate caches. One went into a weatherproof container buried in the wooded edge of Daniel's property. The other was locked inside a metal cash box and stored at a church 2 counties away under the care of a pastor Daniel had represented years earlier in a labor dispute. Ethan began testing the trust of his co-workers, not with questions those could be overheard, but with small opportunities to see who noticed, who hesitated, and who quietly acted. When a kitchen assistant named Carmen Lewis slipped him a page from the shift schedule showing irregular overtime entries, he knew he had an ally. When James Rudd, a groundskeeper, handed him undeclared hazard logs, he had another. By Friday, there were 6 of them. Each carried their own fragments of proof: underpaid invoices, threatening text messages, photographs of unsafe work conditions. Nothing was stored on cloud accounts or personal phones. Daniel taught them how to use disposable cameras, then remove the film and store it in foil packets to prevent accidental exposure. Written records were kept in block letters on plain paper, with no names, only initials and dates, each set of initials cross-referenced on a separate sheet kept elsewhere. The network widened in careful increments. Ethan's contact list grew, but only through direct introductions. Each new member had to bring verifiable evidence and agree to 2 rules: never discuss the group inside the estate, and never store originals in any place that could be searched without a warrant. It was Carmen who suggested they needed someone who could move beyond collection, someone who could shape their findings into a story that wouldn't be ignored. Daniel hesitated. Outside exposure meant risk, but eventually passed a message through a contact in the city. 3 days later, Samantha Ruiz arrived. An investigative journalist with a reputation for surviving lawsuits, she met them in the back room of a closed diner on the edge of town. No laptops, no phones, only spiral notebooks, a voice recorder shielded in a sound-dampening pouch, and the slow precision of someone who knew what this could cost. She listened as they laid out the Langford pattern: humiliation as a tool of control, wage theft as standard practice, political corruption as insurance. She didn't flinch when shown the video of Preston Langford Jr. forcing Ethan onto the floor. She didn't interrupt when Daniel slid across a printed copy of the ledger naming Sheriff Wade Calhoun's retainer fee. The plan was to build the case in layers. First, compile worker testimonies enough to demonstrate a consistent pattern of abuse. Second, pair each account with corroborating documents. Third, secure multiple copies of everything stored offline and in different jurisdictions. Samantha would act as custodian for one set, releasing it only if certain triggers were met: Ethan's arrest, Daniel's disappearance, or a credible threat against any member. But the Langfords were already moving. Within a week, an online smear campaign surfaced painting Ethan as a serial troublemaker with a history of theft. Stock images were passed off as security photos from other estates. Anonymous accounts repeated the same talking points across local forums. The next blow landed on Daniel. His home went up in flames one night while he was in the garden too far to stop it. The fire marshal's report listed accelerants, but the investigation stopped there. The sheriff's office called it an unfortunate act of vandalism. In the ash, Daniel found the metal shell of the cash box that had held one of the evidence drives. It had melted into useless slag. Then came the arrest. Deputies arrived before dawn, charging Daniel with the arson of his own home and the murder of a handyman whose body was allegedly found in the debris. The charges were grotesque in their convenience. Ethan watched from across the street as Daniel was shoved into a patrol car, one arm-bandaged face set in a mask that betrayed nothing. By midday, 2 members of their small network had cut contact. A third sent a message, short, apologetic, final: "I have kids. I can't keep doing this." That night, Ethan stayed in a motel under a false name. The television in the corner replayed footage of Daniel being led into the county jail, the news anchor repeating the sheriff's words about violent tendencies and troubling history. The anchor didn't mention the fire marshal's report. She didn't mention the ledger, the threats, or the fact that Daniel had been on the phone with Ethan when the first flames appeared. The network was wounded, but not dead. Late in the evening, a knock at the motel door brought 5 of the remaining members inside. Carmen carried a battered violin case. She set it on the bed, flipped the latches, and revealed a thick envelope and a canister of microfilm. From before the fire, she said, "Walter's backups. Paper can't be hacked." The envelope contained photocopies of payroll ledgers, bank statements, and the ledger pages Ethan had seen in the basement. The microfilm held scans of every photograph they'd taken in the past 2 months. Ethan sorted through the pages in silence, the faint chemical scent of toner in the air. The Langfords could burn homes, poison reputations, and bribe law enforcement. But they couldn't destroy what they didn't know existed. The network had shrunk, but what remained was tempered steel. The Langfords' annual winter charity gala had been on the town's calendar for decades. It was a performance disguised as philanthropy, a night of sequined gowns, crystal champagne flutes, and carefully staged generosity that doubled as a networking summit for anyone who wanted access to the family's influence. The event was covered by local television and streamed online for donors in other states. For Ethan Cole, it was also the only public gathering where the Langfords' grip on Maple Hollow loosened just enough to let cameras in from the outside. That made it the perfect breach point. The surviving network met twice in the week, before the gala, always in different locations, never with all members present at once. Carmen Lewis carried the largest portion of the evidence in her violin case. James Rudd handled the microfilm reels hidden inside the hollow shaft of a broken rake. Samantha Ruiz, the journalist, coordinated with her editor in the city, securely through couriers and prepaid devices, to prepare a timed release of the material to national outlets. The strategy was simple in outline, complex in execution. Deliver a condensed package of the most damning documents to a pre-vetted FBI contact in another state, bypassing local law enforcement entirely. Use the gala's live coverage to present the humiliation video and key ledger entries in real time, making them impossible to dismiss as fabrications afterward. Trigger Samantha's editor to release the full investigation online as soon as the broadcast aired, ensuring the story spread faster than it could be suppressed. Security at the gala was visible, but predictable metal detectors at the main entrance, uniformed guards stationed at the perimeter. Inside the ballroom glowed under tiers of chandeliers, white tablecloths stretching toward the elevated stage where Margaret Langford would make her annual speech. Preston Jr. hovered at her side, already bored. Ethan moved through the room in the same black and white uniform he had worn for every Langford event, the tray in his hands, a shield as much as a prop. No one looked twice at a server. His route took him past the camera crew, contracted for the evening, a local team with a live feed running to the television truck outside. In the parking lot, James was already in position near the broadcast van. His role was to connect a preloaded media stick to the van's secondary input port, forcing the humiliating footage and selected ledger scans into the live feed at the moment of Ethan's signal. Samantha waited off-site with her finger on the release trigger for the full package. When Margaret stepped onto the stage, the room hushed in practiced reverence. She began with the usual platitudes: the family's commitment to community growth, their pride in upholding tradition. The crowd responded on cue, applause swelling at each pause. Ethan's path took him to the stage's side curtain. From there, he could see the teleprompter script scrolling in front of Margaret, the timer counting her minutes. At the 3-minute mark, he tilted his tray, letting one glass roll and shatter against the floor. The sound snapped heads toward him, giving James his window. In the broadcast van, a faint click signaled the switch. The feed wavered, then cut. The ballroom's giant projection screens meant to show Margaret's speech suddenly displayed a different scene. The image was grainy but unmistakable. Preston Jr. seated at the head of the long dining table, phone in hand, ordering Ethan to the floor. The audio captured every bark, every command, every burst of laughter from the guests. Faces in the crowd turned to watch themselves on the screen, their expressions frozen in the same smiles they had worn months earlier. A ripple moved through the room, gasps, then murmurs, then the scattered sound of chairs scraping back. Margaret's voice cut through, once sharp, but the microphones were no longer hers. Ledger scans filled the screen's pages, showing bribes to city officials, offshore transfers, and Sheriff Calhoun's retainer renewal marked at 6 figures. Outside, the television feed carried the same images to viewers across the state. Within seconds, Samantha's editor launched the full article online, embedding the video and documents in a way that ensured copies would multiply faster than they could be taken down. The reaction was immediate. Reporters in the room raised phones to capture the crowd's collapse into chaos. Donors slipped toward the exits. A few guests confronted Margaret directly, voices rising. Preston Jr. was led off stage by a bodyguard, his face pale, his earlier boredom replaced by confusion. 15 minutes later, the doors of the ballroom opened again, this time to federal agents. Not the local deputies in familiar uniforms, but dark-suited FBI personnel moving with the efficiency of a planned operation. Ethan watched as they approached Margaret, read her rights, and guided her toward the exit. 2 more agents escorted Sheriff Calhoun from his table, ignoring his protest. The ballroom moments earlier, a stage for celebration, was now a crime scene. Attendees pressed against the walls or slipped outside doors, their finery catching on chair legs and table corners. The chandeliers kept glowing, but the light now felt surgical, exposing rather than flattering. Ethan did not move toward the stage or the exits. He stepped into a side hallway where Samantha appeared, having slipped in during the confusion. She handed him a small envelope confirmation from her editor that the files had been mirrored to multiple servers overseas, and shared with journalists beyond U.S. jurisdiction. The Langfords could sue, threaten, or buy silence, but they could not claw back every copy. By the time Ethan reached the parking lot, the broadcast van was empty, its doors hanging open. James was already gone, taking his route through side streets to avoid the main roads. Carmen drove past slowly, the violin case still on the back seat. Inside the mansion, the gala would be remembered as the night the Langfords lost their untouchable status. Outside, the story was already beyond their control. The strike had landed. The network had survived long enough to see the first crack in the wall. Maple Hollow woke to a different weather the morning after the gala. It wasn't in the sky. There were still the same low clouds over the courthouse, but in the way people moved through town. Conversations dropped when certain names were mentioned. Shopkeepers kept televisions on tuned to national channels, replaying the footage from the Langford ballroom. The humiliation video had gone viral overnight, paired with headlines about federal corruption investigations. Margaret Langford was held without bail in a federal detention facility 2 states away. Preston Jr. was sent to stay with relatives in another part of the country, his face blurred in most coverage, but recognizable to anyone who had lived here. Sheriff Wade Calhoun resigned within 48 hours, citing health reasons in a letter that did not mention the 6-figure payments from the Langford ledger. The FBI moved methodically. Search warrants swept through the estate, the Langford construction offices, and a handful of city departments. Each time agents emerged, they carried bankers' boxes sealed with red tape. The local police, stripped of their most loyal enforcer, played no role in the process. For Ethan Cole, the shift was subtle but real. No more side glances from other staff, no whispered reminders to keep his head down. The mansion was closed, its iron gates chained. The small network, what remained of it, met one last time in the back of the closed diner. Carmen set the violin case on the table and opened it for the first time without tension in her hands. Inside was nothing now. The evidence had been copied, archived, and placed under federal custody. Daniel Price wasn't there. Released from county jail but under protective watch, he had been moved out of state to testify in sealed proceedings. His house remained a burned shell, but his name had been cleared publicly by the same channels that once painted him as dangerous. Letters from him arrived in careful intervals, each one noting progress in the case, each one ending with a reminder that the work wasn't finished. Ethan took his first trip away from Maple Hollow a month later to speak at a labor rights summit in Atlanta. He didn't tell the organizers every detail he didn't need to. He spoke about the mechanics of silence, how it's built, how it's enforced, and how it cracks when enough people refuse to reinforce it. His words carried the authority of someone who had carried humiliation in his pocket and decided to make it evidence instead. Back in Maple Hollow, change came in pieces. The Langford estate was auctioned, the proceeds held in a restitution fund for underpaid workers. Several local officials faced indictments. Others quietly left town. The construction company's projects stalled, then restarted under new ownership with stricter oversight. The old patterns didn't vanish overnight. There were still those who muttered that the gala ambush had been disrespectful, that the town's reputation had suffered. But others began to speak more openly about long shifts without pay, about safety violations ignored, about contracts lost to favoritism. Stories that had been currency in whispers became part of the public record. Samantha Ruiz's article remained online, mirrored across dozens of outlets. Each time a Langford attorney filed a takedown request, another copy would appear somewhere else. The video of Preston Jr. circulated in schools as a cautionary tale about power without empathy. Ethan no longer wore the black and white uniform. He began working full-time with a regional labor rights organization, his role split between field investigations and training workers on how to secure their own evidence. He taught them Daniel's rules: no cloud storage, redundant offline copies, multiple jurisdictions, paper ink, and human witnesses before anything digital. On his last visit to the locked gates of the Langford estate, he stood where the stone steps met the garden path. The roses had gone wild without Daniel's shears, their blooms heavy and leaning into the walkway. Somewhere under the soil lay the capsule Daniel had buried that first night, the one holding the initial copy of the humiliation video. It had never been retrieved. It didn't need to be. The truth it held was no longer vulnerable. The air smelled of cut grass and the faint sweetness of overripe petals. Ethan let himself take in the quiet, the absence of laughter that once filled these walls. Not victory, victory implied an end, but the steadier weight of knowing that the wall had been breached and would not be rebuilt exactly the same. In the months ahead, there would be other cases, other towns, other families, whose wealth insulated their cruelty. But Maple Hollow would no longer be one of them. The Langfords had believed ownership was permanent, that silence was the natural state of the people beneath them. Ethan had learned otherwise. Silence was maintained, which meant it could be dismantled. He turned away from the gate and walked back toward town where the diner was open again, and the people inside were speaking at a volume that for the first time in years didn't drop when someone like him walked in. It wasn't the end. It was just a different kind of beginning. The wreckage looked deliberate, almost curated linen like torn sails, flowers gutted from their stems, silver chafers tipped to bleed sauces down the patio stone. Guests gathered in small, stunned constellations, parents clasping children who had dressed to feel special, and instead learned a new shape of fear. At the center stood the groom, a tall black man in a tuxedo scuffed by gravel and sugar, his jacket salted with crumbs from a cake that would never be cut. He kept his hands visible and his voice low, the practiced choreography of a person who has done this dance before. This was Dorian Hayes, though no one here said his name like a headline. He had chosen a quieter life than the one available to him, a row house, history, a public bus, kind of humility, even now, as the most powerful elected official in the state. Across the hedge, the neighbor raged herself hoarse. Evelyn Carradine, 59, heir to Carradine and Sons, and every grudge she felt the world owed her prowled the property line like a metronome of contempt. The week had eaten her gnawing up sleep patience and the thin membrane between conviction and obsession. This mixed crowd of kin and colleagues, this joy that refused to apologize for itself, offended a narrative she'd spent a lifetime defending. "You don't belong here," she barked at the air, at the music still playing from a Bluetooth speaker someone had forgotten to silence. "I won't watch this street turn into a circus." She dialed with theatrical care, holding her phone so witnesses could see, because performance is a cousin to power. Her tone to dispatch was pitched and breathless. Her verbs were sharpened for effect. "There's a gang gathering at my neighbor's home," she said. "I see weapons. I've been threatened. Send everyone." When the operator asked for specifics, models, counts, whether anyone was injured, Evelyn's answers grew cinematic. Machetes, handguns, men circling. She knew what those words could pull to a scene. Dorian heard enough to grasp the arc. He called to the wedding planner, Rosa Almeida, to begin moving children and elders inside. No rushing. Rushing looks like running. He sent Caleb Brooks, the foster brother, who had flown in the night before to the side gate to await officers and greet them with a calm recitation of what they would see. A private event with a ruined spread, a trespassing neighbor, no weapons, a pile of smashed cake. Rosa, who'd logged 2 decades of backyards and banquet halls, was already filming on her phone, panning slowly, narrating time and context, pointing out the doorbell cameras that would capture the fence line breach and the ribbon tearing that had started at dawn. Documentation wasn't a reflex anymore. It was an instinct. Neighbors emerged just far enough to be counted. Some hid behind curtains, phones peeking like periscopes. A few drifted to the sidewalk in gym shorts and sandals, the uniform of suburban curiosity. The ones who knew Evelyn best kept their distance. She had chaired the HOA for 10 years and sued 2 households over mailbox styles. Carradine and Sons had the security contractor for the subdivision on retainer. The off-duty guard posted at the gate had already learned to treat her calls as orders. None of that conferred official authority, but power seldom waits for paperwork. Sirens bent the afternoon first, a rumor, then a blade of sound that split conversation into kindling. A dispatcher wary a city away had added a line to the call log possible hoax. No corroborating calls yet, also tagged the report weapons visible because she must not gamble on restraint when so many careers had been burned on the altar of a wrong guess. Protocol would arrive with steel in its spine. Dorian looked toward the street and made choices that kept him alive in other rooms. He stepped to the center of the yard where he could be seen where cameras could see him being seen. He raised his empty hands at shoulder height, palms forward. He instructed Rosa to hold the amplifying mic for the ceremony and to record his voice as he spoke the facts, steady and slow. Private residence. Private wedding. Neighbor trespassed. No weapons present. Children and elders inside. I will comply with all officer instructions. He didn't say his name. Names can inflame before they de-escalate. Evelyn, tasting victory, crossed the hedge entirely, now heels sunk in turf she had not earned. She had already unspooled the table runners, flung deviled eggs like stones, and toppled the champagne tower with the blunt force of a forearm. She added words because she believed words were scaffolding for reality. "You people," she hissed again, as if repetition could make a slur sound like zoning law. "You bought this with cash no bank would take if they checked. You think you're safe because you hid behind a pretty party." From the walkway, Harold Bell, Naomi's father, a man who had worn grease under his fingernails for 30 years, and pride like a second skin, watched his daughter kneel to salvage the surviving half of a sugar flower. He said nothing. The words he had in him were the kind that knot throats and get quoted later. He put a hand on Caleb's shoulder. It meant, "I know what you're thinking." It meant, "Don't." The cruisers rolled in as if the street had been drawn to scale for them, red-blue washing over clapboard and glass. Doors opened not with theatrics, but with training. 2 officers fanned left, 1 right, 1 held center. Holsters stayed snapped, but knuckles brushed leather, a gesture that might read like threat in a camera lens, but felt to the bodies who made it like insurance. Their eyes did the quick calculus: tuxedos, flowered dresses, a violin case, folding chairs, cake on concrete, the neighbor breathing like an engine that had lost its timing and landed on a contradiction. The radio in the sergeant's collar crackled with the dispatcher's addendum: "Be advised, caller is a single reporting party. No independent verification. Approach with caution." Rosa held the microphone up and kept recording. Dorian did not move toward the officers. He waited to be addressed. He felt the eyes train on him as the tallest black man in the open space, the point upon which fear and expectation naturally balance. He found the sergeant's gaze and nodded, small, professional, and said, "Because this is how you survive, sir. We'll follow your instructions." The sergeant's brow furrowed, not at the words, but at the timbre. Calm is a credential. Evelyn rushed that same sergeant palm up with her phone, as proof, breath painting the scene with mad flourish. Drugs, knives, threats, a promise to burn the neighborhood down. She stabbed a finger toward the reception tent, as if pointing could conjure contraband, as if volume could become evidence. The sergeant's jaw tightened the way jaws do when experience meets theater. He scanned the edges again, doorbell cameras, vendor trucks with invoices taped inside windshields, a string quartet trying not to be in the frame, and revised his threat model. Across the lawn, Naomi Bell, the bride who had spent nights stitching Grace into a day she wanted to feel like a soft landing, dusted sugar from her palms, and stood. She took one full breath, then a second, and reached for the edge of Dorian's sleeve, not to anchor him, but to remind herself of the skin she was fighting to live inside unafraid. The sergeant lifted his chin to speak commands that would set the temperature of the next 5 minutes. Somewhere behind his eyes, a file cabinet cracked open, a face on a mailer, a voice from a town hall, a policy briefing on community grants that had bought his precinct new radios last winter. Recognition didn't surface yet, not in a way he would trust in front of peers and cameras. He would do it by the book first. He would do it slow. And then from the hedge, Evelyn laughed a short, triumphant sound, as if the sirens had been instruments in a song she had composed. It echoed off the stone and the tinted windows, and for a breath, every adult on that lawn made a private promise to themselves about what they would not allow this afternoon to become. Hands where we can see them, the sergeant began, voice pitched to carry without breaking. The microphones heard. The cameras saw. The air waited to learn what kind of story this would be. 3 months before the sirens bent Magnolia Heights into a knot, the street was as immaculate as a model home brochure. Lawns like green felt, driveways scrubbed to pale cement. A place built to convince residents that certain troubles couldn't cross its brick gates. Dorian Hayes had no interest in convincing himself of that. At 34, he had already learned that trouble ignored gates. His childhood in the Roosevelt Park neighborhood had taught him early that zip codes were only a backdrop, not a shield. His mother, a postal carrier who kept her head down through both summer heat and winter slush, and his father, a cafeteria manager who could stretch a sack of beans into 4 meals, had raised him on the idea that titles meant less than what you did with them. By the time he became governor, Dorian had avoided the governor's mansion altogether, choosing instead to rent an apartment walking distance from the Capitol. He knew the optics, no motorcade, no marble foyer. But he also knew his own comfort zone, and it wasn't under a chandelier. That made the decision to buy a house with Naomi Bell, his fiancée, a leap into something uncharted. Naomi, 29, a pediatric surgeon whose skill was matched only by her stamina, wanted a yard a place for her father to plant tomatoes and space enough for her nieces to chase a soccer ball without dodging traffic. The Hayes-Bell home search had been deliberate. They'd chosen Magnolia Heights because of its quiet streets and mature trees, not its pedigree. The Victorian on the corner came on the market at the right moment, priced fairly. They signed without fanfare. To them, it was a home. To one neighbor, it was an invasion. Evelyn Carradine noticed the moving truck before she noticed the couple. She had inherited the 3-story Carradine Manor next door and the construction company that bore her family name, both in various states of decay. Carradine and Sons had been bleeding contracts for years, losing bids to younger firms with leaner crews and fewer overhead sins. A multi-million-dollar state infrastructure contract on the docket was her last chance to keep the business from foreclosure. Her assistant had circled a meeting in red ink on her calendar, Governor Hayes, Monday, 10:30 a.m. Evelyn had never met the governor. She'd skimmed an article about him, once dismissed his campaign ads as background noise, and filed away the name without a face. So when she looked out her bay window on that sunny Saturday and saw a tall black man carrying boxes across the lawn next door, she didn't put the pieces together. What she did assemble was faster and meaner money. They shouldn't have status. They hadn't earned a smile that dared to suggest they belonged. On Tuesday, she made her approach. A plate of macadamia cookies as a prop, a blazer in pastel blue to soften the lines of her mouth. "Welcome to Magnolia Heights," she said, standing just far enough into their yard to make it clear she could. "We have certain standards here." Dorian, still in sweat-darkened t-shirt and jeans, shook her hand without hesitation. "I'm Dorian. This is Naomi. We're looking forward to being part of the neighborhood." His voice had the even weight of someone accustomed to being quoted accurately. Naomi offered a smile that was genuine, even in the face of Evelyn's measuring eyes. She mentioned her work at St. Luke's Children's Hospital. Evelyn nodded, filing away the details the way you mark measurements before cutting material you already know you don't like. She went home and began watching the white Range Rover in their driveway, the delivery of new patio furniture, the weekend evenings when friends came by, the occasional burst of music or laughter. In Evelyn's mind, the equation was simple. Their comfort was her loss. Their joy was proof she was being left behind. By the time wedding preparations began, her irritation had calcified into strategy. She'd seen the trucks from the florist, the tent rental company, the catering van with its logo in cursive gold. She started logging dates and times, dialing the HOA president to complain about traffic and noise. "They're changing the character of the neighborhood," she told him. "You let one event like this happen, property values sink." The president reminded her that private events were allowed under the bylaws. She took that as a dare. She called the security gate to challenge every vendor vehicle. She stopped a linen delivery truck in the cul-de-sac and told the driver the event was canceled due to criminal activity at the address. When the driver asked for clarification, she let her voice drop into the cadence of scandal. "The police are investigating. You'd be smart to leave." Some vendors shrugged her off. Others called Naomi in confusion, forcing the couple to confirm, reschedule, recoordinate. The interruptions chipped away at the smooth anticipation they'd hoped for. Evelyn didn't stop there. She left anonymous complaints with the city's noise control office whenever the sound system was tested. She cornered Naomi's grandmother at the mailbox and hissed, "This isn't your neighborhood." She intercepted Dorian's foster brother on arrival from the airport to ask if he was lost, directing him toward the other side of town with a sweetness that tasted like rust. Most of it happened in daylight, but her worst offenses began after dusk. She slipped onto their property to pull flowers from arrangements, scatter garbage over the lawn, slice the ribbon on rented chairs. She told herself it was minor sabotage, harmless. A reminder to people like that Magnolia Heights didn't bend easily. From her window, she saw Naomi pick up the pieces each morning, Dorian sweeping the walk with the patience of someone refusing to yield. She didn't know his title yet. She didn't care. And then, a week before the wedding, Evelyn's assistant slid a folder onto her desk with the details for Monday's meeting. Governor Dorian Hayes. Photo attached. She glanced at the headshot, the suit, the flag pin, the posture built for podiums, then set it aside without looking too hard. The man next door wore t-shirts and work gloves. The governor wore ties. Two different people. She never looked close enough to see the truth. The week before the wedding was supposed to be about small joys, finalizing the playlist, tasting the caterer's last menu tweaks, placing candles where the evening light would catch the wax just right. Instead, Dorian and Naomi found themselves in a war of attrition. They had not declared one in which their opponent lived 15 feet away. It began that Monday morning with the florist's van idling at the Magnolia Heights gate. Evelyn Carradine had parked her Range Rover diagonally across the entrance, forcing the driver to brake. "Wrong address," she announced, leaning out her window. "No one like you lives here." The driver, a young woman with a bundle of invoices, insisted she was headed to number 214. Evelyn's tone iced over. "You've been misled. There's been trouble at that house. Best turn around before you waste your time." When the flowers still arrived an hour later, Evelyn called the Homeowners Association. Noise ordinance violation, she reported. They've got music blasting at 9 a.m. It's disturbing the peace. The HOA secretary dutifully logged the complaint, though she could hear only birds through the phone. From then on, Evelyn treated each vendor visit like a trespass. She stopped the tent crew on Tuesday, telling them the event had been canceled due to drug activity on the property. She phoned the bakery on Wednesday to say the bride had been hospitalized and wouldn't need the cake. She contacted the rental company on Thursday with a warning about gang members seen at the house. The lies were a moving target, each one crafted to spook, to erode confidence, to seed the idea that the Hayes Bell wedding was a bad investment of anyone's time. Some businesses called Naomi to confirm their voices wary. Each time she smoothed the edges of their confusion, apologized for the trouble, assured them they'd be paid in full. But each call left a small dent in her optimism, as though the day she'd been building toward had been left outside in the rain. In the evenings, Dorian and Naomi sat on their porch with mugs of tea, trying to hold the shape of their plans in the face of so much petty malice. "She's trying to make us regret being here," Naomi said one night, her eyes fixed on the hedgeline. Dorian's reply was quiet, but firm. "She doesn't get to write that ending." But Evelyn wasn't finished. The harassment stepped off the phone lines and onto their property. One night, the marigold garlands strung along the fence were shredded petals scattered like confetti for an event that had already ended. Another morning, Naomi found the welcome signage for the ceremony snapped clean in two, mud-streaked across the script. Bags of garbage began appearing in their yard, spoiled fruit coffee grounds, leaking through thin plastic meat wrappers, buzzing with flies. Her most vicious strike came when Naomi's grandfather arrived from California. The man was 80, with a slow but steady gait, leaning on the cane he'd carved himself decades earlier. He had saved for months to attend his granddaughter's wedding. As he walked up the driveway, Evelyn intercepted him. "Go back where you came from," she barked loud enough for the hedges to repeat it. "You and your whole family don't belong in this country, let alone this street." The old man's hand trembled on his cane. Caleb was at his side in seconds, ushering him inside, while Naomi stood in the foyer, tears sliding unchecked down her cheeks. Dorian gathered her in holding until the shudder in her shoulders eased. Rosa, the wedding planner, had been documenting everything: cell phone footage, date-stamped photos, incident logs. "Governor," she said one evening without thinking about the title. "This is criminal harassment. We should involve the police now." "Not yet," Dorian replied. "We're not giving her a bigger stage." The neighbors existed in uneasy silence. Some left folded notes of support on the Hayes' porch unsigned. Others looked away in the grocery store. A few those Evelyn had long counted as allies nodded in passing as though she were in the right. The subdivision's hierarchy was built on social capital, and Evelyn still had enough of it to keep most mouths shut. Friday night, the air had that electric stillness before a storm. Inside the Hayes Bell home, votive candles were set aside for tomorrow, the final table settings checked twice. Outside under the street lamp, Evelyn stood at her mailbox for a long time, flipping a letter open and closed. The envelope bore the state's crest, the contract packet she intended to present at Monday's meeting. She had glanced at the first page earlier, noted the signature line for Governor Dorian Hayes, and convinced herself once more that the man next door and the man in the headshot were not the same. Saturday began clear and gold-edged, the sort of morning couples imagine when they plan an outdoor wedding. By 6 o'clock, Evelyn was in motion. She walked the property line like it was her personal border to patrol. She untied every ribbon she could reach, tossed roses into the street, split the stems of hydrangeas. She leaned over the fence to drag the welcome arch forward until it cracked at its base. By the time Rosa arrived at 7 for final preparations, Evelyn was still in the yard, hands full of someone else's flowers. "Ma'am, this is private property," Rosa said, her voice level but taut. "What you're doing is vandalism." Evelyn's eyes glittered like a challenge. "This is my neighborhood," she replied, "and I won't let you turn it into a ghetto." Her words hung there, sour and irreversible, over the trimmed lawns and manicured trees. The day had only just begun, but the war she'd started was about to breach every gate Magnolia Heights had ever built. By 2 o'clock, the Hayes Bell backyard had been transformed into something close to magic, despite the morning's damage. Naomi walked the aisle between folding chairs lined with what flowers could be salvaged, her hand brushing the silk of her dress to keep it from brushing the grass. Dorian waited under the arch Rosa had braced, with hidden dowels, the fabric drape hiding the fracture from Evelyn's dawn attack. Guests had settled into the rhythm of the ceremony, the air filled with the muted joy of something hard-won. That's when the shouting started again. Evelyn Carradine's voice tore through the vows like a thrown stone. "This is a respectable neighborhood," she screamed from her yard. "Take your noise and your people somewhere else." Most guests tried to ignore her, but then she climbed the fence. Her feet hit the grass with the certainty of trespass. She stalked toward the buffet, overturning trays of lemon chicken and roasted vegetables, sending them crashing to the ground. She reached the 3-tier cake Naomi had dreamt of since she was a resident working night shifts, sugar flowers in blush and ivory, and shoved it from its pedestal. It landed with a wet thud, buttercream splattering the hem of Naomi's gown. And then came the words that made parents cover children's ears. "You animals don't belong here." Evelyn spat, her face twisted with heat. "I don't care how much dirty money you spent on this house." The racial slurs that followed weren't new to history, but they landed like fresh glass breaking. Caleb moved to restrain her, but she clawed at his hands, spit flying. Guests backed away. Naomi knelt by the cake, touching a sugar petal as if to confirm the ruin. In the middle of the wreckage, Evelyn pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Her voice to the dispatcher was a study in weaponized panic. "Yes, there's a gang here, armed, threatening me. I saw guns, knives. They said they'll burn down the neighborhood and kill every white person here. Send every unit you have." Sirens followed within minutes, a wail that made the youngest guests cry. Dorian's jaw tightened. He knew what happened when police arrived expecting armed black men. He moved fast, but careful, directing Rosa to get the children and elders inside, telling Caleb to wait by the gate and speak first to any officers. When the cruisers rolled up 2, then 4, their doors swung open in unison. Officers fanned out hands grazing holsters. They'd been briefed for a dangerous call, multiple armed suspects, threats of mass harm. The scene didn't match. They saw formal clothes, overturned food, a tent sagging on one side. No weapons, no brawl, just chaos in the shape of a ruined celebration. Sergeant Paul Thorne, 20 years on the job, scanned the crowd, then Evelyn, who was rushing toward him with her phone still in hand. "Thank God you're here," she cried. "They've been threatening me for hours. They're criminals. Look at them." She pointed at the guests with a trembling hand, her voice climbing into hysteria. "Arrest them all before they destroy the neighborhood." Thorne's eyes moved from her to Dorian, who stood near the arch tuxedo, torn frosting on his sleeve hands at his sides. The posture, the calm something about it, itched at memory. He'd seen this man somewhere, not defined by chaos. One of the younger officers leaned in to Thorne. "Sarge, this doesn't look like a gang thing." Thorne didn't answer. He was still trying to place the face, the voice, when Dorian said in a steady tone, "Officers, there's been a serious misunderstanding. We've had a trespasser. No weapons here. We'll comply with whatever you need. The words clicked into place. The mailers, the TV debates, the grant signing last fall. Thorne's eyes widened. Governor Hayes. The backyard froze. Conversations halted mid-breath. Even Evelyn stopped moving, confusion chasing anger across her face. Governor, she repeated like the word belonged to someone else. The other officers stared, recognition dawning. Dorian nodded once. Yes. Evelyn's lips parted, her mind dragging pieces together. The Monday meeting, the contract she needed to save her company, the headshot she'd never really studied. "Oh my God," she whispered. You're the governor." Her knees bent as if the truth had weight. Thorne's voice over the radio was low and tight. "Dispatch confirm current location of Governor Dorian Hayes. I have him on scene reported as the leader of an armed gang." Silence stretched. Then the dispatcher's voice came back, tinged with disbelief. "Governor Hayes has no public events today. No security detail assigned." "Why?" "Because Thorne said, eyes on Evelyn. He's standing in front of me. And this call is false." The shift in the air was palpable. The officers' hands dropped from their holsters. Rosa's camera caught Evelyn's skin draining to gray. Every guest now understood exactly who she'd been attacking, not just a neighbor, but the most powerful man in the state. Evelyn's voice cracked. "Governor Hayes, please, I didn't know." Dorian's reply was quiet, but unflinching. "You knew exactly what you were doing. The only thing you didn't know was who I was." The reckoning had begun. Sergeant Thorne's professional mask hardened. "Ma'am," he said to Evelyn, "step over here." He began photographing the broken arch, the smashed cake, the scattered petals, the toppled food tables. Other officers moved through the crowd, taking statements from guests who spoke of a week's worth of threats, vandalism, and racial slurs. Rosa produced her phone, scrolling through time-stamped videos, Evelyn tearing down garlands in the pre-dawn dark, flinging trash over the fence, blocking delivery trucks. By the time Thorne finished his notes, the charges were stacking like bricks: criminal harassment, vandalism, filing a false police report, trespassing, and because of the language Evelyn had used, hate crime enhancements. Evelyn tried every deflection. "I thought they were criminals. I was protecting the neighborhood. I'm not racist. But the words died under the weight of too many witnesses. The click of the cuffs around her wrists sounded louder than the sirens had minutes earlier. The woman who had ruled Magnolia Heights with intimidation was marched to a cruiser, neighbors filming every step. The news cycle ignited before the car even left the curb. Someone had live-streamed the wedding, capturing Evelyn's rampage, and the moment she realized the man she'd been targeting was Governor Dorian Hayes. Clips flooded social media: racist neighbor ruins governor's wedding, hate has consequences, from power to handcuffs. By nightfall, Carradine & Sons' website was offline under the crush of public outrage, and her business partners were already distancing themselves. By Monday morning, Evelyn's meeting with the state was canceled permanently. Contracts evaporated. The board of directors convened an emergency call to remove her. 3 weeks later, she stood in a courtroom, pale and diminished. Her attorney warned she could face 5 to 7 years in prison. The judge's expression was unreadable as the clerk read the charges. And then Dorian rose from his seat. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady. "I'm asking that Ms. Carradine's charges be reduced to misdemeanors on the condition she prove her change through actions, not words. 6 months of community service in the neighborhoods she targeted. Mandatory anti-bias training. No state contracts until she demonstrates sustained reform." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The man whose wedding she had destroyed was offering her a path to redemption. Judge Marisol Kent fixed Evelyn with a sharp gaze. "This is an extraordinary act of grace. Don't waste it." Her first day at the Martin Luther King Jr. Community Center was brutal. Assigned to clean floors and scrub bathrooms, she endured open hostility from residents who recognized her. But she showed up again the next day. And the next. Slowly, she began to hear stories: a single mother working 2 jobs, a teenager caring for siblings while his mother recovered from surgery, an elderly man starting a literacy program. These were the others she'd feared, people with lives as layered as her own. 3 months in, the director asked if she would mentor local entrepreneurs. She hesitated, then agreed. She helped Marcus Reed start a landscaping business, Elena Vega launch a catering company, and Destiny Price open a daycare. The work changed her more than she expected. At her review hearing 6 months later, Marcus, Elena, and Destiny spoke on her behalf. Destiny's words landed hardest. "She didn't just help me start a business. She proved people can change if they choose to." The judge reinstated her eligibility for state contracts, starting small with the construction of a new wing for the same community center where she'd served. 1 year to the day after the ruined wedding, Dorian and Naomi hosted a neighborhood barbecue. Among the guests, neighbors of every background: Marcus with his family, Elena serving food, Destiny holding her baby, was Evelyn Carradine, wearing a simple dress carrying a tray of peach cobbler. She moved quietly, smiling without performance. Naomi leaned toward Dorian as they watched Evelyn help a little boy reach the dessert table. "Maybe this is what victory looks like," she said. "Not crushing your enemies, but helping them become better people." Dorian nodded his arm around her. "Hate destroys. Love rebuilds, even the people you least expect." The evening wound down under strings of lights, the hum of conversation replacing the memory of sirens. The backyard that had once been a crime scene now held something far rarer: proof that even the deepest prejudice can be dismantled, not by erasing the past, but by building something stronger in its place. The wedding Evelyn had tried to ruin had become a story of transformation, broadcast far beyond Magnolia Heights. And in that story was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response to hate isn't punishment, but the courage to offer a second chance, and the humility to take it. What happens when a small-town department's unchecked power spills off the highway and onto a family's front pasture, turning a quiet morning into a tactical reckoning? Watch as Deputy Curtis Langford's swagger collides with a man he never should have cornered, and a web of corruption begins to fray, thread by thread. Comment where you're watching from, so everyone can join in and enjoy the story. Don't forget to like and subscribe if this pulls you in. If you like this story, remember to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. By 8 a.m., the Hale farm had already settled into its practiced rhythm. Dew clung to the grass like glass dust. A low wind combed the tops of the pines. Hens murmured in the coop as if reciting old gossip. Thomas Tom Hale worked the fence line with a carpenter's patience and a soldier's economy-level wrench check move repeat. The motion was meditative. It kept his hands busy, while a different part of him kept tally tools counted in and out, gates latched angles of approach to the barnyard in case life decided to turn. Old habits never quite retired. Maggie Hale crossed the yard with a basket and the kind of gait that had learned to carry a family through thin seasons. She'd been up before dawn baking bread for Sunday exchange wrestling feed schedules against a forecast that promised a dry week and trouble for the lower pasture. Their son Aaron ferried 50-pound sacks from the truck bed to a shaded corner of the barn, stacking them in a grid his father couldn't help but admire. The boy had lengthened and steadied this year. The clumsy edges of childhood were gone. Responsibility had started to fit him like a coat. The sound arrived before the dust, a slow, deliberate crunch of tires on gravel. Tom straightened without dramatics. Shoulders set. Breathing eased. He wiped his hands on a rag and watched 3 county SUVs float into view, light bars, dark windows, up confidence heavy. No sirens meant no emergency. No emergency meant a performance. Doors opened in sequence. Deputy Curtis Langford led thick-necked eyes scanning like a man who enjoyed being watched. Bryce Keenan and Mark Dobbins fanned wide the spacing too neat to be accidental. They wore the look of officers who believed their presence alone was explanation enough. Tom took in the angles, the distance to the nearest fence post, the weight distribution of each man as he stopped. He also noticed what was missing: no warrant envelope, no clipboard. They announced what they were looking into: stolen equipment, unlicensed sales accusations tossed into the air the way bait is tossed into murky water. The phrasing was careful, practiced. Not an allegation, just a suggestion. Not a search, just a glance. They advanced anyway. Keenan cut a line toward the barn as if the ground owed him a path. Maggie stepped to intercept, offering records she'd kept, with the ruthless neatness of farmers who know paperwork can starve you faster than drought. Keenan's shoulder clipped her hard enough to jar the basket and scatter eggs over the dirt. The yolks spread like small suns. Aaron moved on instinct, planting himself between Keenan and the doorway. Dobbins arrived behind him and used the barn wall like a second pair of hands, slamming the boy against planks baked brittle by summer. The sound cracked across the yard. Cattle raised their heads in eerie unison. A nick bloomed along Maggie's cheekbone, where shell and grit had caught skin. This was not an inspection. It was choreography, one the Hales recognized from 100 quiet stories traded in parking lots and pews. Tom did not rush. He let the seconds stretch long enough to be sure 3 deputies, no body cameras activated, no warrant, produced 2 points of unlawful force, a trespass in progress. He noticed their radios chirp with the deadpan rhythm of coded updates. He noticed the way Langford's hand hovered near his holster without commitment, as if he needed Tom to give him a reason he could write down later. Tom gave none. He moved only when movement became non-negotiable. The transition was small, weight shifted hips, turned hands empty, but decisive. He stepped through the space Keenan had left exposed and broke the sequence that had been laid on his yard, a sharp, precise strike to the joint in Dobbins's wrist that unlocked Aaron's arm, a heel that took the deputy's stance from under him without spectacle, a redirection on Keenan's draw that sent plastic and steel clattering across hood paint, a rotation on Langford's center line that borrowed his balance and repaid it to the ground. No flourish, no noise, just mechanics. It lasted less than a breath for each man, 4, perhaps 5 seconds, in the long count of a bad morning. When it was over, Aaron stood free, heart racing, but upright. The deputies were not bleeding, but the message was carved clean into the scene the choreography had cost them the lead. Tom cleared the weapons as if he were disassembling a small engine. Magazines stripped chambers, emptied parts placed where they could be seen. He left no piece where a nervous hand could mistake intent. He said little. He did, however, take out his phone and record plates, faces the empty warrant pocket. It wasn't bravado. It was chain of custody. Langford's radio cracked with new instruction, tone clipped, not panicked. Tom didn't need the words to know the gist. Disengage, document, regroup. 3 factors had shifted the calculus. First, liability. 2 civilians. 1, a minor, visibly unarmed injuries likely to photograph well. Second, witnesses. A neighboring tractor had idled to a stop at the far fence line, its driver half standing for a better view. Third, the lack of paper, nothing to justify a continued presence beyond the bluff they'd already overplayed. The smarter move was retreat reports and a plan with a longer fuse. They took it. The SUVs reversed in screw-shaped arcs, tires hissing on gravel. Doors slammed in angry unison. Dust billowed high and hung over the road like a curtain after a bad show. Within the minute, the yard was quiet again. Even the hens had gone still, heads twitching in the peculiar way birds keep their terror private. Maggie pressed a towel to her cheek. Aaron flexed his wrists, the ghost of cuffs still hot on the skin. Tom gathered shells and rubber bands and placed them in a small bucket fragments of the morning, each tagged in his mind with time and sequence. He photographed the cracked eggs, the scuff on the barn wall, the boot tread printed near the coop door. He uploaded video and stills to a cloud folder 3 states away, then mailed a copy to himself, to his sister in Savannah, and to a friend whose number he hadn't used in years. None of it was dramatic. It was all survival. Only then did he sit on the porch step, facing the road, posture relaxed, to anyone who didn't know him, eyes trained on the bend where red clay met pines. The family finished chores with a new quiet. The day warmed as days always did. But the air held a metallic edge, now a taste like pennies under the tongue. The script they had refused to follow would not be abandoned. It would be rewritten elsewhere at a time the authors believed more convenient. Near noon, a convoy of thoughts assembled in Tom's head. The inventory he would take, the hardware he would buy without announcing it to clerks who chatted too much, the calls he would place to people who never asked small talk. He thought of patterns, the kind that don't appear in a single incident, but in echoes across months and counties. He thought of the women at church who had lost parcels in the last year, of men who said little because saying more made trouble grow teeth. He thought of how easily a story could be buried if you let the first scene end with nothing but adrenaline. The fence line stood complete behind him, plumb as a plumb line. The eggs in the dirt had turned dull. The map of his land, every dip, every oak, every reach of shade, reassembled itself in his mind as something else, a perimeter, a promise, a line that did not move. As the afternoon stretched, he filled a notebook with notes and times, and a simple sentence underlined twice. We do not go looking for a fight. We build the record that ends one. When evening came, he checked the porch light, the barn locks, and the angle of the camera he had mounted years ago for foxes. He sat once more facing the road. Somewhere west beyond the tree line and the county offices, men were typing versions of the morning that made them heroes. That was fine. He had learned long ago that the first report rarely wins. The evidence does. By midweek, the Hale farm looked outwardly unchanged. Chores ran on time. Livestock moved through the same grazing rotations. The weather had turned warm enough for the lower pasture to dry, revealing fresh tracks from the weekend's patrol vehicles. Tom photographed those too, marking their depth and direction in a log that was starting to fill faster than he liked. The deputies had not returned in person. That absence was not mercy. It was a sign of recalculation. In small departments, sudden aggression without paper to back, it often meant internal justifications were being drafted. Elsewhere, reports, polished timelines, adjusted a chain of command convinced. Retaliation was coming. It simply needed a narrative first. 2 days later, the first probe arrived in sound rather than sight. A pickup idled along the county road just after sunset. Engine held low brake lights, winking in a rhythm that had no traffic logic. The security camera on the front gate caught it drifting past, pausing long enough for the driver to light a cigarette, then moving on. Tom saved the footage to 3 separate locations. It was a small move, meant to read the temperature of the target, but small moves often signal bigger ones warming up. He began visiting the hardware store without waiting for a reason. Extra lengths of heavy chain, fresh locks for every gate, weatherproof wiring and motion sensors rated for the kind of storms that swept through in late summer. At the electronics shop in the county seat, he kept his explanations vague, paying cash for a set of trail cameras, high-lumen spotlights, and a civilian market drone with thermal capability. Aaron watched each trip from the porch, carrying boxes into the barn without asking questions. His father's tempo had shifted from maintenance to preparation, and he knew better than to dilute that focus with chatter. Maggie noticed too. Her way of matching it was quieter. She called a cousin in Savannah to confirm a safe place to send hard copies of their growing evidence pile, then started scanning every farm-related bill and receipt into organized folders. 3 nights after the roadside idling, the escalation came. It began with an engine, not the hesitant hum of a vehicle unsure whether to stop, but the hard, urgent growl of one pushed too fast on gravel. The sound cut across the pasture's darkness, closing the distance to the house in seconds. Before headlights reached the yard, 3 shots cracked in quick succession, each punctuated by the shattering of glass. Tom was already moving before the second shot. Years of room-clearing drills set his path, one arm sweeping Maggie toward the floor, the other snatching the emergency flashlight from the counter. Aaron's voice came from upstairs, sharp and startled, but he stayed put, the one directive Tom had drilled into him since he was 12. A 4th shot punched through the kitchen window, scattering glass into the sink and across the counter. The air turned sharp with the smell of spent powder. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound receded, engine rising in pitch gravel, spitting from spinning tires, taillights swallowed by the bend in the road. Silence returned with a different weight. Tom stayed crouched until the last trace of the engine faded, then moved through the house in low sweeps, flashlight angling into corners, beam cutting across jagged holes in drywall and glass. He saw quickly that the shots had been aimed high, likely meant to frighten more than wound, but fear had never been their family's currency. Disruption was. At the fence line near the road, something caught the beam, a pale square pinned to the wood with a hunting knife. The note's letters were rough and deliberate. "This is our county. Learn your place." Tom took photos before removing it with gloved hands, sliding it into a plastic sleeve, then sealing that in a waterproof pouch. Evidence, not message. Back inside, Maggie had already swept glass into neat piles, her movements steady in the way that comes from refusing to give panic its moment. Aaron had started a new folder on the laptop marked Threats, Direct. The note went in first. The next morning, Tom called a man he hadn't spoken to in over a year. Alan Price answered on the second ring, a voice that still carried the clipped cadence of military briefings. The update Tom gave him was stripped of emotion deputies on his land, without warrant, physical contact with family, a nighttime shooting, a written threat. Price didn't waste breath on disbelief. Within hours, Price called back. His voice had dropped half an octave. The pattern wasn't isolated. 3 other Black-owned farms in adjacent counties had been visited by law enforcement in the past month under similarly thin pretenses. Equipment seized, citations issued. In 2 cases, foreclosure proceedings had followed within weeks. The common thread was land plots adjacent to proposed development corridors. Price's phrasing was blunt. "They're building a pipeline of seizures. Your farm is already marked." The theory made sense of details Tom had noticed, but hadn't tied together. The deputies' non-arrest after their failed bluff. The idling truck. The shooting aimed for noise instead of blood. They weren't trying to win in one move. They were trying to make the Hales' lives untenable over time. That afternoon, Tom redrew the farm's perimeter map, not for grazing rotation or irrigation planning, but for surveillance placement. Every gate, every natural choke point, every approach that offered cover. The trail cameras went up first, their lenses tucked under pine boughs and roof eaves. Motion sensors followed invisible until triggered. The drone ran its first loop at dusk, thermal imaging painting the fields in ghostly tones. Deer browsed along the fence line, raccoons nosed through compost. No humans tonight. Tom saved the feed anyway, time-stamped and cataloged. In the barn, Maggie organized a shelf into two sections, one for feed and tools, the other for labeled evidence bags, photographs, scanned documents, video drives. She didn't need to ask whether the pile would grow. She just made sure there was space for it. By nightfall, the property looked the same to passing eyes, neat rows of fencing weathered barn boards, a porch light glowing against the pines. But inside its boundaries, a different architecture had begun to take shape, a net woven not to keep danger out, but to catch it, name it, and make it undeniable. The Hales had seen enough to know the next move wasn't theirs to make. It would come from the same road the SUVs had used days earlier, and when it did, the cameras would be rolling. The first call went out before sunrise. Tom sat at the kitchen table with a mug, gone-cold phone on speaker, and the farm's new surveillance feeds scrolling across a laptop screen. 3 names, 3 skill sets he trusted more than most people trusted blood relatives. He hadn't called them in years. He didn't need to explain much. Each man understood the stakes after the first few sentences. By the following afternoon, they arrived in sequence. Sam Ortiz was first stepping out of a weathered Jeep with a laptop bag that had seen more war zones than coffee shops. His specialty was digital intrusion systems, records, networks, the kind of work that revealed what people tried to bury. Hawk Delaney came next, tall and silent, moving like a shadow even in daylight. His eyes swept the tree line and fence line before he shook Tom's hand. Hawk was surveillance incarnate patterns, routes the art of watching without being watched. Reggie Miles rolled in last, driving a battered utility van lettered with the logo of a non-existent communications company. He carried 2 cases that clicked open to reveal microphones disguised as power outlets, cameras no bigger than shirt buttons, and a stack of laminated credentials that would get him past most doors without a second look. Introductions were short. Maggie set out coffee and bread on the dining table, but the men gravitated toward the maps and photographs already spread across it. Sam's fingers were moving before he sat, laptop breathing heat, as he tunneled into county property records. Hawk marked patrol patterns on a large printout of the area lines connecting clusters of black-owned farms. Reggie sorted his devices by Target Sheriff's Office Courthouse County Planning Department. Aaron watched from the doorway until Tom waved him in. He took a seat beside Hawk and started copying patrol times into a ledger. Hawk handed him a small rangefinder and explained how to log distance and angle from safe positions. The boy's pencil moved steadily, his face set in concentration. By evening, the first pass of intel was coming in. Sam's search had pulled up 18 months of land transfers from foreclosed farms to shell companies with no visible business operations. A single development firm sat at the center, Magnolia Ridge Holdings, fronted by an unremarkable board, except for one detail: the chairman was the brother-in-law of Sheriff Curtis Langford. Hawk's review of the surveillance logs confirmed something else. The patrol cars didn't just cruise by. They circled, paused at certain angles, and often did so after dark. The routes matched with incidents reported by neighboring farmers, vandalism, missing livestock, sudden citations for violations that didn't exist. Reggie returned before midnight from his repair job at the sheriff's office communications room. He'd planted microphones in the break room evidence locker hallway and Langford's private office. Their feeds would stream to a secure server Sam had spun up in less than an hour. Maggie, meanwhile, had been calling families they trusted, farmers, store owners, even a school bus driver whose property line had been shifted on paper without his consent. She collected statements and scanned every document they provided. Patterns emerged on her spreadsheet: foreclosures, clustering along projected highway expansions, farms with water rights near proposed industrial sites, suddenly deemed non-compliant. They worked until 2 a.m., pausing only to refill coffee or adjust camera feeds. The table looked less like a kitchen surface and more like an operations center maps, layered with colored pins, laptops casting blue light over faces deep in calculation. The first audio file from Reggie's bugs arrived as they were reviewing land records. Sam patched it through the speakers. Langford's voice was unmistakable casual as he discussed moving on a property the following week with the same deal as last time for the developer involved. Another voice asked about the Hale farm. Langford's answer was colder. Different approach. Break them slow. Make it hurt. No one in the room spoke until the file ended. Tom saved it to 3 encrypted drives, uploaded a copy to an off-site server, and slid one of the drives across to Maggie. She placed it in a small fireproof safe by the pantry without comment. The plan shifted. They were no longer just documenting harassment. They had an open admission of conspiracy. That meant timing mattered. The right moment to expose it could turn a county's narrative in an hour. Too early, and it would be buried under counterclaims and falsified reports. Too late, and the Hales' land could vanish into someone else's ledger. Before they broke for the night, Tom drew a short list on a yellow legal pad: key meetings to capture vehicles to track properties at most immediate risk. Hawk would shadow the deputies' evening patrols from a distance. Sam would dig into Magnolia Ridge's finances, tracing their shell companies outward to find the money's true origin. Reggie would plant additional devices at the county planning office, targeting conversations about zoning and development. Maggie added her own task to the list, organizing a private meeting of targeted families at the church hall. No press, no flyers, just word passed quietly to those who needed to be there. When the table finally cleared, the farm was silent again, the drone making its steady loops above the pasture. From the porch, Tom watched its lights sweep across the dark tracing arcs of quiet vigilance. Inside, 3 men who had once followed his orders in places far from here now followed them again without needing to be told why. The net was in place. Now they would wait for the kind of arrogance that made men like Langford believe they could speak freely. And when it came, the recorder would already be running. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in the county courthouse annex, the kind of monthly gathering where zoning disputes and pothole complaints usually filled the air. That night, the seats were fuller than usual. A quiet ripple of recognition followed Tom Hale as he took a spot near the back, a black case under his arm. Maggie sat beside him, her notebook ready. Hawk had chosen a position near the exit. Sam and Reggie remained outside monitoring live feeds from both the courthouse security cameras and their own devices. The first 40 minutes passed in routine monotony: road repairs, budget shortfalls, a motion to repaint the water tower. Then the chairman opened the floor to public comment. Tom rose, walked forward, and placed a small USB drive on the podium's surface. He stated his name for the record and requested the council view a series of recordings relevant to ongoing law enforcement conduct in the county. The projector warmed with a faint hum. The first clip filled the screen: Deputy Bryce Keenan at Earl Johnson's farm, arriving without a warrant, shoving the 73-year-old farmer backward until he fell. The footage was clear enough to catch the dust puffing from Earl's jacket as he hit the ground. Gasps moved through the room. The next clips rolled in sequence: patrol cars, making slow, repeated passes by targeted properties. Late-night meetings with unmarked trucks. Gates found open and livestock gone the next day. A time-stamped map appeared showing incidents clustering around black-owned farms along planned development corridors. No narration was needed. The pattern was visible in every pin and date. From the front table, Sheriff Curtis Langford's posture tightened. He stood objecting that the footage was unauthorized surveillance, but the chairman deferred, citing the public comment rules. and the right to present evidence. Maggie's pen didn't stop moving. Every interruption, every attempt to control the room went into her notes. The final clip landed hardest audio from Langford's office, recorded 3 nights earlier. His voice, easy and unguarded, outlined payments from Magnolia Ridge Holdings for expedited seizures. "The Hale Farm?" another voice asked. Langford's reply was deliberate. "We break them slow. Make it hurt." The silence afterward was heavier than the air before a storm. Cameras from local news crews swung toward the podium. People in the gallery had their phones out, streaming live. Tom didn't stay for the recess the chairman hastily called. He and Maggie exited through the side door, walking into a wall of questions from reporters. They said nothing, moving to their truck where Hawk waited. The USB and original files were already duplicated in 3 secure locations. By morning, the footage was everywhere: local broadcasts, social media shares, and a link posted by a statewide agricultural advocacy group. Messages poured into Maggie's phone from farmers in other counties describing similar harassment. The pattern was spreading. The retaliation came faster than Tom expected. 2 days after the meeting, Aaron was pulled from class by 2 deputies. A random search of his truck in the school parking lot produced a plastic bag filled with crystal shards. Possession with intent to distribute. Felony. Tom arrived at the school in time to see his son in handcuffs, surrounded by gawking students with phones raised. Deputy Mark Dobbins held the bag aloft like a trophy. The scene was too neat, too staged. Maggie reached for Aaron, but Tom's hand on her arm stopped her. Every face, every badge number, every detail of positioning went into his mental file. He spoke to no one. Not there. At the jail, access to Aaron was denied pending arraignment. The charge sheet was printed with bureaucratic neatness, already signed. Outside, a local news van broadcast a segment about gang-related narcotics activity in connection to recent unrest over law enforcement operations. That night, the farm was quiet, save for the low buzz of the drone making its perimeter runs. Tom sat in his office with the lights off, working through an encrypted contact list. 3 calls each, answered by voices he trusted: Sam Hawk and Reggie were already in motion. The evidence they had was strong, but now they needed the kind of proof that ended careers and dismantled networks. Sam would dig deeper into Magnolia Ridge's corporate web, looking for bank transfers that connected to county accounts. Hawk would track every movement of the deputies, matching them against known meeting sites. Reggie would expand his reach inside county offices, planting devices near planning committees and in the developers' own spaces. Maggie's role was different. She began organizing an off-the-record assembly at the Mount Zion Baptist Church, inviting every targeted farmer willing to speak. The goal was simple: show the faces behind the statistics, link the personal stories to the evidence. In the days that followed, more pieces fell into place. Sam traced property transfers to shell companies in other states. Hawk caught Langford's SUV meeting after hours with James Norwood, the CEO of Magnolia Ridge, at a closed warehouse on the outskirts of town. Reggie's bugs captured conversations about clearing out the last holdouts before the year's end and splitting bonuses after the Hales fold. By the time the church meeting came, they had more than enough to connect the sheriff's department, county officials, and the developers in a conspiracy to seize and flip farmland. All that remained was to capture a hand-to-hand exchange money for deeds with federal agents ready to move. The opportunity would come sooner than any of them expected. The abandoned warehouse sat quiet under a late afternoon haze. Windows clouded with grime let in thin shafts of light that turned airborne dust into drifting gold. Federal agents in plain clothes moved into position with the methodical silence of people who had done this many times before. Hawk monitored the perimeter from a roofline across the street, binoculars resting against a gloved hand. Sam sat in an unmarked van beside Reggie, watching multiple camera feeds stream in from devices hidden inside the building. Tom Hale crouched behind a stack of pallets, flak vest snug under a faded jacket. The warehouse floor had been seeded with cameras, tiny lenses recessed into screw heads disguised in the joints of metal shelving. Every angle fed back to the FBI's secure servers, each recording time stamped and redundant. The convoy arrived with the punctual arrogance of people confident in their control. First came 3 county SUVs, their decals dulled by dust, but still unmistakable. Sheriff Curtis Langford stepped out of the lead vehicle, his stride relaxed, a man in his element. Deputies Keenan Dobbins and Bryce Carver followed, each carrying themselves with the loose readiness of armed men who assumed they would set the terms. Moments later, a black sedan pulled up. James Norwood, CEO of Magnolia Ridge Holdings, emerged in a tailored suit that looked out of place against the cracked asphalt. He carried a leather briefcase, its weight obvious in the way his arms stiffened. They met near a metal table placed under a skylight. Langford produced a large manila envelope. Norwood snapped open the case, revealing neat stacks of banded cash. Their words carried clearly through Reggie's hidden mics: property deeds for 7 farms, all cleared for transfer. Cash payments for expedited seizures. Bonuses for properties secured before the end of the quarter. When Norwood asked about the Hale farm, Langford's answer was the same one the bugs had caught before: break them slow. Make it hurt. The moment the briefcase touched Langford's hand, Agent Diana Martinez gave the signal. FBI on the ground. From every side, agents poured in. Hawk dropped from his perch to block the rear exit. Reggie's van cut off the main drive. Keenan reached for his weapon, but Sam's voice came cold over the loudspeaker. Don't. The deputies froze, hands going high. Zip ties snapped around wrists. Radios were stripped away, evidence bagged in methodical silence. Langford's face drained of color when he saw Tom step from behind the pallets. Their eyes met, a locked exchange, heavy with the knowledge of every move that had led here. Tom said nothing. The evidence spoke loud enough. Outside news vans arrived on a tip Maggie had arranged through an advocacy contact in Atlanta. Cameras caught the sheriff's department leadership and the county's most connected developer being led away in chains. The briefcase, cash still neatly stacked, was carried out under evidence seal. Within hours, Aaron was released from county custody, all charges dropped. The same news cycle that had run footage of his arrest now replayed Langford's own words captured in perfect clarity, alongside the video of him being loaded into a federal transport van. The investigation widened in the weeks that followed, uncovering similar schemes in neighboring jurisdictions. Property seizures, falsified citations, intimidation campaigns, all feeding land to developers in exchange for cash and favors. The arrests in their county were only the start. On the Hale farm, rebuilding began before the case had even gone to court. Neighbors came with hammers, lumber, and livestock trailers. Earl Johnson's fencing went up first, then the burned sections of the Hale's own barn. The workdays turned into community gatherings, meals laid out on long tables, children running between stacks of hay bales. Out of those gatherings came something lasting: the Cross-County Agricultural Cooperative, a legal shield and resource pool for every small farmer in the area. Maggie was elected its first chair. Aaron documented the effort with his camera, capturing the way people leaned on each other when the weight was too much to carry alone. His footage, combined with the sting operation, won him a full scholarship in investigative journalism. On the morning before Maggie left for Washington, D.C., to speak at an agricultural justice conference, Tom walked the fence line. The pasture shimmered in early light dew, turning the grass to silver. He paused at the high point, where the view took in the whole sweep of their land: the rebuilt barn, the tilled rows ready for planting the oak that marked the edge of the property. Maggie joined him, her hand sliding into his. "We're home," she said simply. Tom looked out over the fields. The fight had cost them time, sleep, peace, but it had also drawn their community into something stronger than fear. The net they'd built was still in place, cameras and motion sensors watching the roads in and out. Home, he agreed. The word felt earned. As the sun broke over the tree line, they stood together in the quiet, knowing that corruption would find other places to hide, other people to threaten. But here on this land, they had drawn a line and held it. And if it was tested again, the record would be ready.